Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. It all started so innocently. I remember when we first met, his charm, his laugh, the way he made everything feel so easy. We were so young, full of dreams, building a life together. But somewhere along the way, things changed. The first time I noticed something was off was when he came home late one night, his eyes darting around like he was hiding something. I didn't ask at first, thinking it was just a rough day at work. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. The gambling started small. A few bucks here and there, a poker game with friends. I didn't think much of it. But then it grew. He started going to the casino more often, staying out later and later. The money began to slip away, unnoticed at first, until one day I realized we didn't have enough to pay bills. I confronted him, and he lied through his teeth. "It's just a bad month," he said. But deep inside, I knew it was more than that. It was an addiction taking over our lives. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I convinced myself that he could change, that he would snap out of it. After all, he was the father of my children, the man I loved. But every time he promised to stop, he'd be back at the tables, back to his old ways. Each lie piled on top of the last, and the trust we once had started to crumble. But still, I stayed. I stayed because I loved him. I stayed because I thought that love would be enough to fix everything. The first big loss hit us hard. I had no idea that he had taken out loans, maxed out credit cards. None of it. It wasn't until the creditors started calling that the truth came out. He was deep in debt, far deeper than I could have ever imagined. The bills piled up, and I was left to pick up the pieces. He promised me he'd fix it, but the damage was done. I could feel myself starting to suffocate under the weight of his mistakes, and still, he wasn't ready to stop. He got worse. I watched him fall further into the grip of his addiction. The gambling was no longer a hobby or a phase like he'd promised. It was a life-sucking monster. We moved into a smaller house, sold things we didn't need, but it wasn't enough. The money was gone, and I was left holding the broken pieces of a life I didn't recognize. He'd come home looking like a ghost, empty-eyed, exhausted, and I could see in his face that he knew he was losing everything. But he still couldn't stop. One night, I waited up for him. The clock ticked on, and he still wasn't home. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't like him. When he finally stumbled through the door, his eyes were glassy, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. I was done. The anger, the sadness, the fear, all of it exploded out of me. "You promised me. You promised us." I screamed, but he just stood there, numb, unable to even look me in the eye. That was the moment I realized I had lost him. The calls started coming in again, but this time, they were different. They weren't from the bank, asking for overdue payments. These calls were from people who didn't sound like they cared about a late payment. They were angry, threatening. It wasn't long before I learned that he had borrowed money from dangerous people, people who didn't care if he was a father, a husband, or a human being. They only cared about getting what was owed. And suddenly, our lives felt like they were on the edge of a cliff, and I was holding on by my fingertips. He came to me one night, in the middle of the chaos, and confessed everything. The money wasn't just gone. It was gone to people I had no business being involved with. He had borrowed from the wrong people, and now they were coming for him. But the betrayal cut deeper than the debt. He had lied to me. He had lied to our children. He had put us in this position, and for what? For a fleeting moment of excitement? He begged me to help him, but I was too far gone. I didn't know if I could ever forgive him. I was done. The fear, the constant lies, the betrayal. It was too much. I started planning my escape. I couldn't keep living like this. My children deserved better, and I wasn't about to let them grow up in a world where we were always looking over our shoulder. I packed up the essentials, reached out to my family for support, and started to make arrangements to leave. But just as I was preparing to walk away, he showed up again, drunk, desperate, with nothing but excuses and promises that I knew were empty. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I made the decision. I had to let him go. I had to save myself, save my children, save what little was left of my sanity. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about survival. I couldn't keep living in his shadow, in a world where trust was shattered beyond repair. I walked away that night, leaving behind everything I had once hoped for. And in that moment, I realized something. Sometimes, love isn't enough. Sometimes, you have to love yourself enough to let go. The first few days after I left were the hardest. The house was quieter than ever, and I could feel the emptiness in the air. It wasn't just the absence of him. It was the weight of everything we had gone through. I kept asking myself if I had made the right choice, if I was strong enough to face the future alone. But as the days passed, I began to realize something important. The silence wasn't just emptiness. It was peace, a peace I hadn't known in years. And slowly, I started to rebuild. Though the physical distance between us grew, the fear never quite left. Every phone call, every knock on the door made my heart race. What if he came back, desperate and angry, wanting revenge or pleading for forgiveness? I had to stay vigilant, keep my guard up. But as the weeks passed, I began to trust myself again. I wasn't the woman I had been when he left. I had learned how to protect myself, to stand tall in the face of fear. And I was ready to fight for my freedom. It wasn't long before he showed up again, just when I thought I was safe. The doorbell rang, and I froze. When I opened the door, there he was, standing on my doorstep, looking like a ghost of the man I had once loved. His clothes were ragged, his face drawn and pale. "I'm sorry," he whispered, barely able to meet my eyes. "I messed up. I need your help." But I knew better than to believe him. This wasn't the man who had loved me. This was someone who was broken and trying to pull me back into his mess. I slammed the door in his face. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. For so long, I had wanted to help him, to fix him, to believe in the man he once was. But I realized that he had taken everything from me, and I had nothing left to give. I couldn't keep playing the role of the savior. I couldn't keep enabling his addiction, his lies, his broken promises. It was time to draw the line. I wasn't going to let him destroy me again. No matter how much he begged, the phone call started again. The messages filled my inbox, all of them apologetic, regretful, full of promises. But they meant nothing. I had heard it all before. "I'm sorry. I'll change. I'll make it right." The words were empty, hollow. I didn't need his apologies anymore. I needed to heal. I needed to rebuild my life. And most of all, I needed to stop living in the past. I couldn't keep waiting for him to change when he was never going to. I realized, one evening as I sat in my living room, that letting go wasn't just about him. It was about me. For years, I had held on to the idea of who he was, who I thought he could be. I had invested so much of myself in the hope that one day, he'd wake up and realize what he had. But he never did. And the more I held on, the more I lost myself. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was the only way forward. I had to free myself from the chains of his addiction, his betrayal. It was time to reclaim my life. Slowly, life began to change. It wasn't an instant transformation, but I could feel the shift. I was no longer waiting for the phone to ring or fearing what he might do next. I was learning to live in the present again, to appreciate the little moments of peace I had. My children thrived in the calm environment I was creating. We spent our days playing, laughing, and just being together. There was a new sense of joy in our home, one that I hadn't felt in years, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. Healing wasn't linear. Some days, I was strong. Nothing could touch me. Other days, the wounds of the past would resurface, and I'd find myself paralyzed by grief and anger. But I never stopped moving forward. I sought therapy, spoke with others who had been through similar experiences, and began to understand that my pain was valid. I wasn't weak for being hurt. I was strong for surviving. The more I learned about myself, the more I began to heal. And slowly, I realized that the worst was behind me. It was one ordinary afternoon when I received a letter. At first, I thought it was from him, another attempt to worm his way back into my life. But when I opened it, it was from someone else entirely. It was a letter from a support group I had joined, thanking me for sharing my story. The letter spoke about how my experience had inspired others to keep fighting, to find their own strength in the face of betrayal. For the first time, I realized something. My journey had a purpose. I wasn't just surviving. I was helping others survive, too. With time, I learned to trust again, but not in the way I had before. I trusted myself. I trusted my instincts. I trusted that I could handle whatever life threw my way. I didn't need him to complete me anymore. I had found wholeness within myself. My children and I had built a life that was ours, a life free from fear, free from lies. And while the past would always be a part of me, it no longer defined me. It was just a chapter in my story, not the whole book. The best was yet to come as time passed. I began to rediscover parts of myself I had long forgotten. For so many years, I had been defined by my relationship with him, the wife, the caregiver, the fixer. But now, I was learning who I really was when all those roles were stripped away. I took up hobbies I had once loved, spent time with friends I hadn't seen in years, and started traveling again. I found a new sense of freedom in doing things just for me. It felt like I was breathing for the first time in ages. One of the most unexpected gifts of my journey was the rekindling of old friendships. There were people in my life who had been there for me, waiting in the background, but I had been too consumed by my marriage and the chaos it brought to truly appreciate them. As I healed, these friendships flourished. We spent hours talking, laughing, sharing stories. They were a reminder of who I had been before, a reminder of the strength that ran deeper than any relationship or past trauma. With them, I was not alone. Though I had come so far, there were still moments of fear. Could I rebuild my life and trust again? Could I ever truly let go of the hurt? The fear of being vulnerable again was paralyzing. What if I opened my heart, only to have it shattered once more? I didn't know if I was ready to risk that again. But then, one day, I realized that fear was just part of the process. It was a challenge, not a roadblock. I could take it step by step, building my life on my own terms, in my own time. A few months after I left, I met someone. He wasn't like him, not even close. He was kind, patient, and seemed to genuinely care for me. It scared me to let anyone in again, but something about him felt different. One evening, he handed me a letter. It wasn't anything grandiose, just a few simple words expressing how much he appreciated me. I held the letter in my hands, feeling the weight of it, and realized something profound. Love didn't have to come with strings attached. It didn't have to be filled with drama and pain. Sometimes, it was just simple and pure. I had always believed that the love I shared with my husband was irreplaceable, that it was unique. But as I sat with this new person, enjoying simple moments without fear or anxiety, I realized something. Love doesn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. It doesn't have to come with the chaos, the gambling, the lies, and the betrayal. True love, the kind that builds a life together, is calm. It is steady. It is trust. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe this kind of love was possible for me after all. Though I had moved on, forgiveness was still a difficult thing to grasp. Forgiving him wasn't about excusing his actions or forgetting what he had done. It was about freeing myself from the anger and resentment that had held me captive for so long. One evening, as I sat alone with my thoughts, I realized that forgiveness wasn't something I did for him. It was something I did for me. Letting go of the pain and the need for retribution allowed me to finally heal, to finally breathe without the weight of the past crushing me. Healing wasn't just an external journey, it was internal. I had to learn to be kind to myself, to stop blaming myself for the choices he made. I had to learn that I was not responsible for his addiction, his lies, his decisions. I was responsible only for myself. It took a lot of self-compassion to stop beating myself up over what I couldn't control. But as I worked on loving myself, truly loving myself, I found a strength I hadn't known I had. I became my own source of light. Through it all, I had always had my children. They were my purpose, my reason for fighting, for surviving. Their laughter, their smiles, their love. They were the constant reminder that, no matter what, I was doing the right thing. And as I watched them grow, I realized that motherhood had given me a kind of strength I had never fully understood until now. My children didn't see me as a victim. They saw me as a survivor. And that, more than anything, was the greatest gift I could ever give them. The day I realized that I had truly let go of the past was the day I finally felt free. It wasn't a sudden moment of clarity or a magical transformation. It was gradual, like the slow turning of a page in a book. But when I looked back, I saw how far I had come. I had rebuilt my life, piece by piece. I had found peace in the chaos. And now, as I stared at the future before me, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. This new chapter of my life was mine to write, and I was going to make it a beautiful one. Freedom isn't just about escaping a toxic situation. It's about reclaiming yourself, your joy, your peace. For the longest time, I had thought freedom meant leaving him behind. But now, I understood that freedom was about more than just escaping. It was about choosing to live on my terms, without fear, without guilt. It was about owning my story and realizing that I was the hero of it all along. And for the first time in a long while, I felt free, not just from him, but from everything that had ever held me back years past. Life moved forward, and I became accustomed to the rhythm of my new life. One without him, one filled with peace and joy. But then, out of nowhere, he reached out again. I was sitting in my office, sipping my morning coffee, when I saw his name appear on my phone screen. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to expect. He had never once tried to reach out in the past, and now, after everything, he wanted to talk. I was flooded with so many emotions: anger, confusion, and something I hadn't expected: curiosity. I debated for days whether to call him back. I didn't owe him anything, but there was a part of me that still wondered what had become of him. I could still remember the man I once loved, the man I had hoped would change. So, one evening, I picked up the phone and dialed his number. My heart was pounding. When he answered, his voice was shakier than I remembered, almost as if he was nervous to speak to me. He had changed, but was it enough? I didn't know yet. "I've been sober," he said, his voice almost pleading. We met, just the two of us, in a quiet coffee shop. His appearance had changed, his eyes no longer clouded by the same desperate need for escape. He was thinner, older, and there was an emptiness about him I hadn't expected. But what struck me the most was how much he seemed to regret everything. He apologized for the pain he caused me, the lies, the debts. "I hurt you in ways I never realized until now," he said, his voice breaking. I wanted to scream, to tell him how he had destroyed my life, but I stayed quiet, listening instead. The truth was, I was too hurt to respond. As we sat across from each other, I realized that he had indeed changed, at least on the surface. But was it real? Could a person truly change after so much destruction? I listened, but I didn't trust him. He talked about the years he had spent in therapy, how he had faced his demons, how he wanted to make amends. But deep inside, I knew the truth. Words didn't fix broken promises. Words didn't erase the years of pain and betrayal. His apologies couldn't undo the damage, no matter how sincere he seemed. The meeting left me feeling conflicted. I wanted to believe in his redemption, to give him a chance to prove himself, but I knew better. I had spent years building walls around my heart to protect myself from the pain he caused, and those walls had kept me safe. They were stronger than any words he could offer. I had learned the hard way that love wasn't enough to fix everything. It wasn't enough to heal the wounds he had left. And as much as I wanted to be compassionate, I knew I couldn't allow myself to be dragged back into his world. A few weeks later, he sent me a letter. In it, he told me he had moved on, that he had found peace with himself and had let go of the past. But his final words stood out. "I hope you find the happiness you deserve." It hit me like a wave. I had found my happiness. I had built a new life, one that was free from the toxicity of our past. In that moment, I realized I didn't need closure from him. I didn't need his approval or his apology. The closure I needed, I had already given to myself. And with that, I let go of any lingering feelings for him, finally setting myself free. The days after the letter were filled with clarity. I felt lighter, stronger, and more confident than ever before. I had spent so many years trying to fix something that was beyond repair. I had thought I needed him to move on, but I now realized that the power to heal had always been within me. I didn't need his redemption or his forgiveness. I had already forgiven myself. I was no longer the woman who waited for him to change. I was the woman who had created a life worth living on her own terms. And it was more than enough. It took time, but I eventually came to fully embrace my independence. There were days when I still longed for the companionship, the intimacy that I had once had, but I learned to find joy in my own company. I spent weekends with friends, traveled, and reconnected with passions I had forgotten about. I didn't need a man to complete me. I was whole, just as I was. I discovered a joy in the simple moments, like cooking dinner for myself, reading books I loved, and enjoying the freedom to make my own decisions. I was finally living for me. Love eventually came again, though it wasn't in the form I had once expected. It didn't come with grand gestures or intense emotions. It wasn't a love that consumed me, but rather a steady, comforting presence that grew over time. It came from a man who was patient, kind, and willing to take things slow. He respected my boundaries, supported my independence, and loved me without trying to fix me or my past. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was worthy of a love that wasn't tainted by lies and betrayal. As I look back on everything that happened, I realized that the hardest lessons were the most valuable ones. I learned about my own strength, my capacity for forgiveness, and the importance of setting boundaries. I learned that love isn't about sacrifice or fixing someone else's mistakes. It's about being true to yourself, honoring your needs, and finding peace in your own journey. My past with him will always be a part of me, but it no longer defines me. I have reclaimed my power, and I know now that I am enough. Exactly as I am, though I had moved on. There were still moments when the past would echo in my mind, like a distant thunderstorm threatening to return. Some days, I'd catch myself reliving the pain of those years, the deception, the lies, the endless chaos. But each time it happened, I reminded myself that I was not the same woman anymore. I had become stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The past no longer held power over me. It was simply a part of my story, a chapter that had ended. I chose to focus on the pages yet to be written. Time, as they say, is the greatest healer. The more time that passed, the less the wounds from my past seemed to sting. I no longer carried the anger, the resentment that had once weighed so heavily on my heart. I was able to look back with a sense of understanding, not just about him, but about myself. I had learned how to love with boundaries, how to give without losing myself, and how to walk away when it was necessary. Time had taught me that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about learning to live again. Sometimes, I still catch myself marveling at how far I've come. The journey from heartbreak to healing wasn't easy, nor was it linear. There were setbacks, tears, and moments of doubt. But when I looked at my life now, at the woman I had become, the mother I was, and the person I had grown into, I could finally see the beauty in my scars. They weren't just marks of pain. They were symbols of my strength, resilience, and ability to overcome. The journey was my own, and it had been worth every step. I think back to all the times I tried to make sense of him, tried to fix him, and realized now that the man I thought I loved was an illusion. He was never the person I imagined him to be. He was someone broken, lost in his own demons, and I had been so desperate to save him that I ignored the truth. But the more I faced that truth, the more I saw the lies for what they were. The man I loved was only a reflection of my own fantasies. And once I let go of that illusion, I was free. For so long, I had been defined by my role as his wife, his caretaker, the one who always forgave. But I realized that I had the courage to choose myself now. I no longer needed to bend or break for anyone else. I could stand tall, make decisions for my own well-being, and live a life that was mine and mine alone. And when I thought about all the moments of self-doubt, I realized that choosing myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. It was the only way I could truly be happy and whole again. One morning, as I sat by the window, sipping my coffee and watching the sunrise, I realized something profound. I was at peace. For the first time in years, my heart felt calm, my mind clear. There was no anxiety, no fear of the past creeping back in. I had created a life that was free of chaos, and it felt like a gift. I had spent so long running from the storm, but now the storm had passed. It was just me now, standing in the stillness, and for once, I was content. I didn't need anything more to feel whole. Letting go wasn't just about him. It was about everything. Letting go of the pain, The guilt, the fear, and the shame had been the hardest part. But once I did, I discovered a freedom I hadn't known existed. I could look back on everything that happened without the weight of it dragging me down. I had allowed myself to feel the hurt, to process the anger, but I had refused to let it define me. And in letting go, I had found peace. True peace. The kind of peace that came from releasing everything I couldn't control. People would often ask me how I had survived, how I had managed to move forward after everything I had been through. The truth is, it wasn't a dramatic victory. It wasn't a moment of triumph or grand gesture. It was the quiet, everyday victories that had gotten me here. It was the small steps of reclaiming my power, of choosing myself, of healing. I didn't need applause or recognition. My victory was in the life I had built, in the person I had become, and that in itself was more than enough. Through everything, the greatest gift I had given myself was the gift of self-love. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were days when I still struggled with feelings of unworthiness, but I learned to be kind to myself. I stopped blaming myself for things I couldn't control and started honoring my feelings. I forgave myself for staying as long as I did, and I celebrated myself for having the courage to leave. In the end, I realized that self-love was the foundation of everything, the key to healing, happiness, and a future full of possibilities. As I sit here today, looking forward to whatever comes next, I realize that my story is far from over. The past is behind me, but it's not the end of my journey. There are new chapters to be written, new experiences to be had, and new paths to follow. I have learned that the future isn't something to fear. It's something to embrace, something to shape with the choices I make today. The future is unwritten, and I am the one holding the pen. Whatever it brings, I will face it with strength, courage, and the knowledge that I am more than enough.